Councillors, as always, you're welcome to join in. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kinakina ki uta, kia matatara ki tai, e he aki ana te atakura, he teo, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei, mauri ora.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome to our first ordinary council meeting of 2023. I hope everybody had a fantastic break and didn't get too wet underfoot. Some did. We've got two items on the agenda today. First one being the annual plan. Second one being Muggeridge's pump station. That was sent out as an addendum to the agenda. So we'll start with apologies. I've got apologies for early departure from Councillor Clarkson and Councillor Hodge. Just noting online, we've got Councillor Graff. For those online in the council chambers, we have Councillor Strange, Councillor Dunbar-Smith, Councillor Smith, Councillor Kneebone, Councillor Nicol, Councillor Downard, Councillor Cookson, Councillor Marr, Councillor Hughes, and Councillor Clarkson and myself. Oh, yes, sorry, Councillor Hodge is online. All right, do I have a mover for the apologies? Councillor Hughes, second, Councillor Marr. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. So we'll go to confirmation of the agenda, noting that addendum that is now our new item 6. Do I have a mover? Councillor Downard and Councillor Smith. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Disclosures of interest. Any disclosures of interest from councillors that are not or that are new additions to whatever is currently listed on the registers, or any conflicts with any agenda items today? No? All right. We will then move on to item 5 on our agenda. That's the 2023-24 annual plan proposed budget. Councillors will note we've had a few discussions and workshops up to today just to work our way through. Obviously, local government planning cycles are an interesting thing to get one's head around, and we wanted to make sure that we took adequate time to ensure that there was shared understanding of what the process looks like, both in terms of an annual plan, this being the third annual plan in our current LTP. And then obviously later on this year, we'll kick off our process for our next long-term plan. So we've taken some time just to talk through things and make sure that there's a shared understanding. But we'll kick off the item. Chris, would you like to make any opening statements on it?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you, councillors. Staff are really pleased to be able to present to you this annual plan draft for consideration. Obviously, in the LTP, the previous council had signalled, with the assumptions that were made, a 1.6% increase. And in the last year or so, the world's pretty much changed on us, and we've had to face a few other realities in terms of what that means to our business. The executive has worked really hard. We were facing increases probably in double digits, and we've worked really hard to bring you something which we think is realistic, which is probably under what the inflation has been that we've been facing, and the cost of living. But we've been really mindful that ratepayers have got to pay it. And so we've done our best to bring you something which we believe meets the levels of service that were signalled, but is appropriate to take out to the public. So we've been looking at some of those inflationary, the interest costs that have changed, the insurance premiums and so on, and we've been very mindful of the staff remuneration market having been quite volatile in the last couple of years, and how that affects us as well. The key thing that we do need to get from this, as we've discussed in the last couple of days, is a decision whether you want to make any significant changes that would require consultation. That's very keen to get. It might be decreased levels of service, or it could be new services that would trigger a consultation, because if that were to occur, we've got to get that prepared very quickly and get that out into the public arena. And there will be resourcing implications from doing that. We are hopeful that we might be able to, from today, agree pretty much on most of the substantive matters which are being raised. And so that if we can't actually finalise things today, we'd be pretty close to being able to do so, and there might just be one or two things that you'd want us to look at. Otherwise, we'd have to look at our work programs to plan through this. With that, Chair, I'm happy to pass over to Janine Becker, who has been working tirelessly in the last couple of months to be able to get this report to us. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning again, councillors. Yeah, just I guess an acknowledgement and expression of appreciation for the conversations that we've actually been able to have over the last couple of days through workshops to help build understanding of the information that's in front of you today. I just thought I would go through a bit of the scene setting and the high-level budget assumptions, including the information in terms of rating impacts and where that liability falls based on the budget that is proposed, so the 6.1% increase, but also looking at those areas that have been identified throughout the report in terms of both reductions and additional areas of investment, and just try and quantify that impact for you as well. So Dave, next slide, please. So I guess, as Chris has indicated, in developing this annual plan, we haven't started from zero. It does reflect year 3 of the long-term plan. And the annual plan process is really, its purpose is to confirm those assumptions, work programs and funding for the upcoming year, noting where that varies from what was included in the LTP when that was prepared back in 2020, 2021. So that pre-inflation version of the long-term plan has been used as the basis for preparing this budget. But we've also checked back in on those areas of new investment, the business cases that were approved through the long-term plan, to see, are we on track? Are there any adjustments that we need to reflect through the annual plan budget to reflect that progress? And throughout the report that staff have prepared for you today, those key variations from the LTP are noted. Next slide, thanks, Dave. So again, in terms of that economic context within which we're planning at the moment, an acknowledgement that that is significantly different to the environment when the long-term plan was developed. It's different for us, it's different for our communities as well. We've seen those rapid shifts in interest rates, positively both on the investing side, but also on the borrowing side in terms of council's borrowing program. The labour market is at capacity. We've got almost record low levels of unemployment, and that's driving pressure into the attraction, retention and remuneration of staff. Not only staff, but I guess that whole resource network is full to capacity, and so that contractor availability and pricing is also seeing upward pressure and respond to that labour shortage. But we have talk of recession on our doorstep, and that just creates further uncertainty for us. I think one of the reflections from me coming out of COVID, where we, as an organisation, we tried to predict some of the economic fallout that would hit the country following COVID. We didn't get that right. The the country went into a period of high economic growth rather than recession. So, you know, just I guess understanding that there's uncertainty out there, and we don't know at the moment what that will actually look like for us. There's a lot of commentary, but uncertainty at this point in time what that looks like. But I guess in terms of the annual plan, it really is those externalities that are key drivers of the proposed increase in rates that's being reflected in the budget, so particularly around interest and interest costs, inflation, all of those things that are impacting households across the country. So as Chris has said, as an executive team, we have put effort into trying to mitigate or minimise those impacts wherever possible to land at the position that we have presented to you. And so as noted, next slide, thanks. The proposed annual plan does present an increase in rates revenue from current ratepayers of 6.1%. But that's split between the increase in general rate and uniform charges, so those rates that all ratepayers in the region pay of 2.6%, as well as the increase in targeted rates revenue, which varies depending on the services, of 9.7%. And we have laid out some options for council's consideration around ways that can be reduced and areas for investment, and all of these sit outside of that 6.1%. Thanks, Dave. So here I've noted the potential budget savings that have been identified by staff for council consideration. So they include the deferred commencement of this. We'll go into each of these in detail through the meetings. This is just the high level context. The deferral of the commencement of the Sustainable Homes scheme, given I guess changes in that economic environment within which we're operating, but also still the legislative impediment that we have to council being able to effectively implement this. So that would be a reconsideration of council's role through the upcoming long-term plan. In terms of our land management advisory services, again with delays around central or national direction in relation to farm planning, there is a saving that we can confirm and bank into the revised budget in terms of the phasing of that work, so that we can take savings from money that we've already collected and we can use those in future years when those costs will come to fruition. There's consideration within the report in terms of continuing the Warm Homes Clean Air scheme within the Tokoroa community. It is a scheme that we have struggled to get participation with. Council had agreed to extend that to the end of this financial year. We're in the process of appointing another provider for that. So that will give us a good indication of whether there is actually an ongoing demand for that service over time, but we have funding in the current year for that. And the other one is in relation to the hardship remission, which is an initiative that the previous council introduced as part of their COVID response budget. What we're seeing is we've got $400,000 provided for in the annual plan, which is not being utilised in terms of applications for that hardship remission. So we can reduce the budget provision for that while still retaining the actual remission provisions themselves, with a review of that through the long-term plan. So if all of those changes are agreed, then the increase in rates revenue from current ratepayers would drop to 5.2%.
Let's let Janine get to the end of the, are you covered
Yeah,
with
maybe
this
if I just, I've got the increases on the next slide and then just the overall rating impact. So,
Okay.
And my request is the explanation around what means. That's a generalisation as opposed to how it will impact.
Yeah,
the
and
region.
totally,
And
totally
so
agree with that. But
That's a misleading figure in some
I
respects.
totally
but
agree. Thank you,
it's-
Councillor Smith.
So we can just
So
have some
we'll
more on that.
just continue with the scene setting that you're taking us through.
Yeah.
And then we'll dive a little bit deeper into some of
Yeah, and
particular
so we can see
areas.
that through when we look at the distribution of rating impacts across the region. But just to quantify, I guess, what impact that 6.1% down to 5.2% has, while preparing the rating impact information, had a look in terms of what on the ground that means. This is predominantly all around targeted, general rate funded activities. So a drop from 6.1 to 5.2 results in an estimated savings to ratepayers of 40 cents per $100,000 of capital value. So for a property of $500,000, that's a $2 per annum saving. For $1 million property, that's a $4 per annum saving. For a $5 million property, it's a $20 per annum saving. So just, I think, to bear that impact in mind as we're working through. Next slide, thanks, Dave. So in addition to options to reduce the budget, there are also some proposals included within the report that again sit outside of that 6.1% in relation to business cases for additional investment. And those are set out there, and we will work through those in detail over the course of the day. Assuming all of the savings from the previous slide are banked and all of these areas of new investment were approved, you would see an increase in total rates revenue from current ratepayers of 5.8%. There's another item included in the report, which is around the provision for staff market and performance increases, so an additional 1% for that. Equating to 566,000. If council approved that, in addition to all of the points above, that would see you at an increase in rates revenue from current ratepayers of 6.3%. Thanks, Dave. So I think as Councillor Smith was sort of indicating, averaging across a region of over 200,000 ratepayers can be very deceptive. And so these graphs show the distribution of changes in rates revenue between the current year and what would be applicable in 23-24 based on the 6.1% increase in rates as shown. And so on the left-hand side, you can see the numbers in terms of the percentage increase, and on the right-hand side, the numbers in terms of the actual annual increase in rates revenue. Dave, if we can go to the next slide, please. What this is in essence saying is that across the region, working on the 6.1% budget, the impact to all regional ratepayers, for 80% of our ratepayers, the annual increase would be an amount less than $50 per annum. For 95% of our ratepayers, that would be an increase of less than $100 per annum. But obviously the incidence of that will look quite different in different areas and dependent on particularly the targeted rates that are paid. But this is overall from a regional profile.
So
Sorry,
sorry,
maybe if
that's
I pause
reflective of
here.
the 6.1 or reflective of the 5.8?
This is the 6.1. So everything else is slightly south of here. So I'm happy to pause there just in terms of that scene setting. Otherwise, we get into the key budget assumption.
Right, I'll come back to you, Councillor Smith, if you wanted to expand on your.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The reality is, I was just wanting to highlight that the use of 6.1 or 5.1 or 5.8 is a misleading figure, whilst it's an average. The impact across the region is in double digits down to single digits. So it's a difficult thing when dealing with a large region to try and give a figure. But I think I would like to see a breakdown towards the constituent TAs that will better reflect people's anticipated extra costs in some way. So rather, I think we know what I'm talking about. Thank you.
Yeah. And I guess that's why the language in communicating that 6.1 is an increase in total rates revenue from current ratepayers. So that's looking at council's total budget and current ratepayers. The incidence looks very, very different.
And so that's the increase that council will receive, not what the individual ratepayer will pay. I think that's the difference.
Because it's going to vary.
That's
It's
correct.
going to vary depending on where you're at and whether you're subjected to a variety of targeted rates that we engage with. Councillor Downard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, this is where I struggle with, because just with Councillor Smith and what he's saying, in my region, because we've had the new QV, their rates have gone up 14% just on the QV. So, and then with these rate rises, if we're looking at 6.1, it's an extra 10%. So, you know, there's all that goes into it. So, you know, it might look like 6.1 or whatever the rate we come to, but the reality is in different regions, it's a huge amount. You know, in 22-23, or especially 23 year, you know, we've looked at the doom and gloom around the country, and I know that staff have really trimmed and come back, but I believe that we really need to get down to the core services and maybe trim some even more. That's my feeling.
Madam Chair, if it might be possible, I might ask Janine just to ensure everybody understands how the changes in revaluations across the region work, because the total amount of rate we need to get doesn't change. How it distributes around the region varies, and it's kind of a bit complicated how the rating model works. Janine, I know that one or two councillors were in workshops and might have heard it, but there would have been others who didn't. It might be worth an explanation.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think part of the challenge that we have as a region is 11 territorial authorities that we traverse, and they revalue at different times over a 3-year period. So what we do to equalise that is undertake what's called a projected value assessment. And so QV do that work for us. And effectively what they do is to say, for those councils that haven't revalued, if they had revalued at the same time as Taupo, what would the shift in their capital value have been? And so we use that projected value to go, what is the share of the regional capital value that each territorial authority accounts for? And it's that share of the general rate in particular, because that's the one, general rate and biosecurity rate, they're the ones that are cross-cutting on value. They pay that percentage of the general rate and the biosecurity rate. That gets applied within that territorial authority area. So it does have the impact of some smoothing, and to try and take out the wash that we would get across the region if we didn't do it, depending on who had revalued that year. What we can't do is impact the distribution of rates within that territorial authority area based on the outcome of the revaluation. So if a property has revalued, property's value has moved by more than the average for that area, they will pay more rates. If it's revalued by less, they will pay less. And that's one of the charming features of our rating system. That's the bit that we can't determine, but we do work to try and smooth those humps and hollows that come as a result of changes in property values. One of the challenges that we've had for this year is we're actually still awaiting general revaluation outcomes for 2 councils that are revaluing. So in preparing these rating impacts that we've provided you with, we've estimated what that would be based on the forecast movement last year. Clearly, looking at the impacts for those 2 councils, the movement, I would say, will be more, which will change the distribution across the region. But the information's there indicatively based on best information that we have. I hope that helps. It's favourite word, complicated.
All right, speaking order, I've got Councillor Nicol, then Councillor Hughes, then Councillor Graff online. Councillor Nicol.
Thanks. Janine, just to heads up, as we step through the different items, quite specific, general rate. I like your breakdown of percent. Since targeted is a more specific. To keep an eye on.
Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Janine, to you. You may be able to confirm the figure, but I think somewhere I saw in here that we're talking about a 1.5% increase in overall rates. If you take a starting base, we've increased ratepayers and they're contributing an extra 1.5%. There is not the marginal cost to council is not 1.5% on that. So those costs, the extra rates, if you like, the benefit of that is flowing to existing ratepayers. That's my understanding of how this model works.
Yes, so, and again, I guess this comes down to how we state our increase. So come back to the language, if we say a 6.1 increase in total rates revenue from current ratepayers. So that's those of us around the table who are currently paying rates and will pay rates next year. Alongside that, we have new ratepayers coming into the region who will also contribute to funding council. And so that is reflected in that statement. So yes, in essence, our total rates revenue is up more than the 6.1%, but a portion of that is funded, the 1.5% is funded by new ratepayers.
Thank you.
Councillor Graff online.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Good, good. And look, I asked a question yesterday regarding rate revenue 5 years ago versus rate revenue 2022-23. Rate revenue was 85 million. You may have already covered this, but other people online might not know. 85 million revenue in 5 years ago and 120 million revenue now. And we're talking about inflation, etc., but also the QVs have gone, up a lot going by that. Can Janine just explain just what that revenue's, how it's being, distributed and why the rates are as high as they are when the QVs are going up?
Yeah, so I really want to try and separate out valuation from rates revenue, because valuation is the way that the rates are applied. So who gets to pay how much? They don't in any way, shape or form drive the revenue that council derives. Our revenue requirements are built up from the work that we need to do based on decisions around this table and council's funding policy around how that work is funded, be it through the general rate, a uniform charge, a targeted rate, fees and charges, whether we've got somebody else who actually funds that work as well. Wakakutahi in terms of transport is a great example of that. So yes, our rates revenue, those are the facts. That's how our rates revenue has moved over time. That is based on programs of work that have been approved by subsequent councils over that period of time, but they're not connected to property valuations, or that drives additional revenue available to the council because we've got more growth happening in the region. Hope that helps.
Thanks.
Any other questions before we have Director Becker go into a bit more detail on? Or is it, have you got
so
slides
I've
going
got
into it?
slides in terms of, I guess, an overview of the key budget assumptions. I'm happy to take guidance from the room in terms of the level of detail that councillors want to go through that. It's
I
all
would-
in the report.
Yeah, I would, I'd go through it, but at a high level.
Yep.
And if councillors wanted to ask any points of clarification, we can do so along the way.
Slide then, Dave. Okay, so we'll do a whistle stop tour. Please stop me along the way if you have questions. But pulling out just the key budget assumptions, so inflation. As noted, we have started preparation of this annual plan from a pre-inflation LTP budget. And so staff have considered those areas of council's business that are subject to inflation. In terms of the local government sector, we are provided with advice from Business and Economic Research Limited, so BERL, in relation to those forward projections of what inflation might be. Other than public transport, it's a different case there always. Where inflation is contractually required, that's been incorporated. Where there are general inflation pressures coming, that we've used those BERL indices and they have been provided for you as well. That is a key driver of our budget. So we've got, $1.7 million of costs, plus we've got the indexation on public transport contract costs running at 11%. We understand there's pressure around driver wages and decisions that have already come in front of the council that are being reflected into the budget in relation to these inflationary pressures. In relation to interest income, some good news on this front in terms of the increasing market interest rates, adding about 839,000 into our revenue. And so that's our rates revenue that we get in early in the year, and we invest over the course of the year matched with when we spend it. The counter to that, of course, is the interest rate on our borrowing, which equally has gone up. In the LTP, the long run projection of costs was 2.2%. Our estimated weighted average borrowing cost for 23-24 is up to 5.76%. These figures, both from an interest income and interest expense perspective, are informed by advice from PwC, who support us around our treasury function. So the combination of higher borrowing costs as well as the higher interest rates results in an increased borrowing cost of 2.292 million.
Yeah, probably totally off the planet, but council has a fund which I think is around about 112 million at the moment. I'd just like to know what the level of council's borrowing is at the moment, and what thought had been given to using that fund as a bank, and we fund our own borrowing and interest from that fund. Now,
Yeah.
it's off the planet, but maybe
Not completely off the planet, but probably back to the future, I would say. So prior to 2018, council effectively undertook internal borrowing only, and so we used the capital of the fund as the source of borrowing. In 2018, where we could see the profile of our borrowing increasing, and plus the rate that we could achieve from an investment perspective versus the cost of borrowing at that point in time, we went for an external borrowing program. And that was really to gross up our balance sheet to be able to show assets and liabilities quite separately. So we have been there and we've undone that approach. I think that would be something that we would need to carefully reconsider as part of the long-term plan. I think what we see as a result of that is a concentration of investment risk. Potentially, at the moment, we have a broadly diversified portfolio. There will be various views on the way that that's invested or the risk profile of it. But the funds are reasonably liquid. Whereas if you convert it into a borrowing program, you get a loss of that liquidity and flexibility. But that's certainly something around our whole treasury function that would be an LTP conversation.
I'm happy to wait till the long-term plan to do that, but the ultimate goal, I believe, is that fund is there to service the needs of the community, not to be put off for a rainy day that may never come. So
Yeah,
I'm looking at the current beneficiaries
Yep.
and the future beneficiaries of that
Yep.
fund. So I'll certainly be looking to have that in the long-term plan.
So-
Thank you.
So in terms of just clarifying that, there's about $2 million per annum CPI adjusted, well, CPI with an LTP CPI adjustment, should clarify, that provides a subsidy to the general rate every year for the region. So the fund is invested in a way that the intent is it's managed in perpetuity. And at the moment, the distribution of that fund is to inflation-proof the base capital so that it maintains value, to provide a rate subsidy, and that's in the order of $2 million. There is funding which will expire at the end of 23-24 towards TWACA, so the region's economic development agency. It's a discretionary contribution if the fund makes enough money into council's regional development fund, and then anything else goes into a rainy day equalisation fund. So there is a return each year coming back to ratepayers today through that rate subsidy.
At 2 million inflation adjusted?
Yes, on an LTP assumption of inflation.
Councillor Hughes.
Yeah, just in commenting on Councillor's comments, there is a SIPO which directs what the staff are allowed to do and directs the investment fund. And it's also subject to independent management by MERS's external organisation. So any changes to that would be required to be, that SIPO to be addressed and brought back to council, I assume, for approval. I'd just add to it, that is on the agenda for discussion this year.
Okie dokie, next slide. And then in relation to staff remuneration, so just to note that the LTP had included the provision for this at 2.5%. The 6.1% budget includes provision at 4% for increases. A couple of weeks ago, we had the latest labour cost index information released, which is showing all salary and wages increased 4.1% year to date to December, and that was slightly up from the September quarter. And as noted previously, that unemployment rate at 3.4% is still near those record lows in terms of the whole system being at capacity. Combined with that, we do note, that organisational turnover at 18%, with some areas facing significantly higher levels than that. But just to note, in terms of the way that we budget for staff remuneration, we don't assume that we have a full complement of staff at all times. So we do discount that salary by assuming a 10% turnover, and that we will have a 10-week recruitment lag between a person leaving and the new person starting.
So, Madam Chair, sorry, I've got some questions today. On staff remuneration, I'm aware the government is fueling inflation big time in this area, and that government with all its work programs is taking staff, particularly planners in that environmental space, and paying up to $40,000 over the market rate. So my question really is 4% realistic within this organisation? Because our key people are critical to keep some of the, certainly in that planning space, moving, and therefore using an average of 4%, is that truly reflective of this business's employment situation?
Just to respond to that one.
Yeah,
Chris.
thank you, Councillor Smith. It's something that I've been talking with our People and Capability Manager, Stu Brown, a lot about since he started, and trying to get as accurate information as we can. I think we've been very fortunate that whilst we've had high turnover, we still have retained some good top talent in the organisation, but that's what we have to keep here, because they help drive, you know, the whole organisation and new staff who come in. Certainly, Stu, I'd ask for your comment, but you know, the way I've understood the information is that there's a lot of competition in the market from within local government, from within the total public sector, but also across the private market as well. And it's and we go to strategic pay to get our specific roles to try and get the right market information. And there's a bit of a lag in them being able to give us that information. So we're doing the best we can. Stu, how would you sum up the situation?
Yeah, what you said is right, Chris. And I guess looking back at strategic pay, they have advised that the private sector actually paid sort of on average 3% more than public last year. So that's a significant difference, given that the private sector already pays significantly more. And obviously with all of the stuff that's going on in government, you're talking, you know, there's 40 grand differences there. That's becoming the norm. And it's not just in pockets. I mean, obviously the planners and the engineers, but I'm looking for a business analyst at the minute, and they're asking me for 25 grand a year more than what we've got budgeted for, which was historically a reasonable salary. So it's going to be a challenge across many roles in council, not just specific areas. And we're known to not be the best payer out there in the market. And I guess, I mean, obviously, it's 4 or 5%. I would certainly love to see at least 5%, but we'll talk about that later. Yeah, so it's going to be an uphill battle on salary, and I guess salary is just one element of it, and we have to do an excellent job around our EVP, you know, and what we can do to actually attract people that's maybe not monetary, but flexible working and all the other different things that we can offer. So we're very much looking at it from a holistic approach, but certainly our back is against the wall as far as salary goes, and the more we can afford, the better would be my advice there. I expect the strategic pay next month will come and say, hey, yep, 5% would be the baseline that they'd expect to see us paying.
Thanks, Stu. So we've put 4% in the budgets because we think that's prudent. But the request is, and it's simply like that, if you were of mind, if you were able to give more, that would help us just to remain competitive in the market.
I respect that comment, Chris. The reality is our ratepayers are also squeezed, so it's going to be a difficult issue, but I just want to make sure council can maintain the ability to do business.
If I could perhaps make the comment as well. So what we're talking about here is a general provision for an increase in remuneration. I think the skill comes in some ways in terms of how that gets deployed. We had probably quite a different approach to that coming into this year, which actually saw more of the increase loaded towards the bottom end of staff where that cost of living is really hurting. But it meant that we could make that 4% go quite a long way. And it brought everybody up to pretty much on the market line. So sounds like I'm talking down the money. I guess I'm acknowledging the challenge on both sides, but I think there is skill in how that money is also deployed, not just the total value of it. Okay. Be the last slide from me. So one of the other key budget drivers that we've called out is just depreciation expense. So council's required to revalue its assets, and in this case, we're really talking our core infrastructure assets on at least a 3-yearly basis, if not more often, if values have moved. We are at that point in terms of a revaluation due. And so the budget is assuming a movement on that based on desktop revals that were done to the 30th of June. So that adds an extra 1.1 million of depreciation funding in. That provision is slightly lower than was in the LTP, but is obviously an uplift from an annual plan perspective. Whether we've got that right or not, we will find out when the revaluation actually lands. There's always a little bit of a lag factor with that. And then finally, I guess, on to those assumptions that we've already probably touched on, which influence how we communicate or state the impact to ratepayers. So from a regional growth perspective, we've assumed that there will be 1.5% growth in regional capital values and the number of properties in the region, which contribute, those new ratepayers contribute to the costs of council. And then the equalisation of capital values is the conversation that we've had in terms of that projected value, trying to smooth out the differences in the timing of revaluations across territorial authorities. And so those effectively a couple of the key influences in terms of what that rate dollar actually looks like when it hits an individual ratepayer's bill. Madam Chair, I think that is. Oh no, there's more. Sorry. Okay, LTP business cases. So really just to reflect that we are starting from that baseline of the 2021 long-term plan, and that had included in it some commitments in terms of new investment by way of business cases. As mentioned, what we have done is checked in on progress towards those as part of the annual plan development. Most of them remain on track with some rephasing or slowing of investment, and so we've called out those key variations through the report, and as other directors present, they can highlight those as well. Where we have sought new investment, we have effectively replicated that the investment decision-making process from the long-term plan. So staff put proposals up, they've been assessed by the executive, and we have a handful of business cases for council to consider. They're not in the budget, they are outside of it. We are in your hands in terms of that decision-making. And then final, well, I will call this my final slide. There's another one there, but we can skip over that because it's just a summary. We've also noted in the report that council does hold a prior year surplus. So these are general rate funds that have been accumulated from the 21-22 financial year. They are available for council to consider through the annual plan process or through future business operations that give you a little bit of ballast if there's the unforeseen challenge that might come up. There's something that you need to respond to in quick order. There is money there. We've had some conversations about that to date, and but just to highlight that is available to you through your discussions. And then the final point is, and I know you've had a number of workshops already this year around the resource management system reform. Just to note that is coming. The assessment is that the 23-24 year will be a lot of that preparation, understanding, analysis, but no additional funding required in the annual plan. So there's no provision or change noted for that. That will undoubtedly look quite different as we start to enter into the 2024 LTP conversations. Madam Chair, I think that now is everything from me. I'll just skip over that one, Dave. The next one.
Right. So how are we going to go through the next So are we gonna have,
Yeah, so
relevant
the
directors
way,
join us, or?
yeah, so the way we've got the presentation that will step through each of the groups of activities. Each director will present for their areas. It really just calls out from the report the key changes. I guess there's the opportunity then for council to discuss those. We can capture changes as we go through, if that's noted, that we can then recap at the end of the day.
Thanks, Janine, and good morning again, councillors. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, as you will recall, yesterday to go through the business we're in presentation on the topics, but we did cover off one of the elements we're going to be talking about shortly, which is the business case. So we did cover off the Tauranga Whenua area from which this business case comes, but we'll go back to the presentation and the next slide, please. Just a very brief overview, I guess, in terms of the funding period, which you're well and truly aware of. We're not proposing any significant changes in the governance area, which we did cover off yesterday in terms of the business we are in. As I've already mentioned, we will be talking shortly about the iwi Māori Partnerships Engagement business case. That's covered quite comprehensively within the pack you've been provided with. And in terms of the conversation on the Sustainable Home Scheme update, I believe that was covered off reasonably well yesterday. Unless there's any further questions, we can pass it over to the appropriate person at that point. So if you're comfortable, we'll move straight into the business case that's proposed in front of you today. So I guess, the key points about this business case is that it is a new approach to a statutory requirements and obligation that are very comprehensive for council. The business case is on page 71 of your report. It does outline in great detail the rationale and the background as to why we are seeking this additional investment and the process by which we recommend we would apply the funding should it be provided by council. So as is identified in the business case, there's quite a significant resource gap between what we do within our organisation and what iwi are able to do within theirs. So the statutory drivers that require us to engage and consult with iwi on a vast range of matters that this council is responsible for. And it spans quite a number of areas. So policy planning, our delivery of services through integrated catchment management, and a range of other delivery activities associated with the resource use group. So they're variable in terms of that demand and that effort, but they do require iwi participation in multiple elements of those three domains. Some of the statutory drivers or legislative drivers include the Local Government Act, the RMA, Treaty of Waitangi legislation, for which drives partnership agreements and arrangements that we have specific functions we are required to perform. Things such as a national policy statement, in particular, one that's quite relevant at the moment is the freshwater management NPS for 2020, all of which have requirements on council when developing or considering a policy or a planning arrangement to engage and get iwi participation. As already mentioned, it's very one-sided. We're resourced for that, iwi aren't. And the downside of that is that we have the effectiveness of those engagements can be diluted by the ability of iwi to participate and engage. What does that do? It protracts our process, it burns more cash in undertaking it, and leads to ineffective outcomes in long timeframes. And we've seen that. We've seen and experienced that on many occasions through a number of the processes that we're working through at the moment. And I know that you will have covered some of these off in some of your recent workshops and talking with Tracy and her team around some of the challenges that they experience in that engagement space, and is an expensive and costly exercise to undertake. You'll see on pages 22 and 23 of your of the report. I'm hopeful I've given you the right page numbers there. That we've done a sort of a very much a wet finger in the air estimate of the costs currently associated with undertaking the activities as we do them. You know, and that number I think is quite modest. It's about $408,000 is what, and that was the best assessment we could do based on the database of information that we use, that we could try and as clearly as possible align staff time spent on iwi engagement to try and bring the outcomes we're seeking with quite probably not the degree of efficacy that we would desire. So that gives you a brief breakdown in terms of that expenditure and where it's gone. But like I say, it's a pretty, I think, a light calculation of where the money's going to achieve the statutory obligation and requirement. So what are we seeking through this business case? We've put up a number of options, and we have consulted with our iwi partners to seek their views on what might be the best approach. So 3 options are identified in the mix. Those include service level agreements, formation of a central contractor hub from which iwi can access contractors to help support them in their engagement with us, or to fund internally existing project managers doing work on programs of work that are relevant to iwi, that require iwi engagement, to enable them to expand that function. Within the business case, it clearly outlines in quite a bit of detail, in my view, the pros and cons of the 3 varied approaches. It also shows in the table in the business case what iwi's preferences were. The majority do prefer service level agreement arrangements to be entered into. From our point of view, that also gives greater clarity and control over the type of outcomes we're seeking and the process that we would follow to achieve that, what each party is responsible for and how that would translate into action. However, what we're proposing is all 3 options are in the mix, and that they are treated as on an as needed basis, recognising that SLAs were in general the preferred option of all those that we consulted with. Now, there are constraints around each and every one of these, and we don't say that they are perfect solutions, but based on what we currently do and what we believe we need to do, or actually know we need to do, these were seen to be the best path forward. The amount that we're seeking is in the region of $200,000. There is an expectation that some money is carried forward, so that would reduce in the outer years to around $100,000 per annum. So what we're talking about here is the annual plan year next year. So we're seeking a $200,000 contribution from that in that regard. Now, I think. Yeah, I think we've pretty much covered off the broad sense of what we're trying to achieve here and why we're trying to undertake the activity the way it's proposed. The quantum of money that we're seeking, is significant. I don't diminish or underestimate that in any way, shape, or form. However, compared to what we probably need and what we're probably spending at the moment, it is quite nominal. In my view and in the view of staff who have prepared this report. We also recognise that the SLA arrangement that we've talked about would not be able to be sustained across all of our iwi partners. It's just the cost would be prohibitive. So we would need to take a prioritised approach to the allocation of that money, and it would be on those who have, I guess, the most benefit and impact from the investment would be first up. They would be 12-month service level agreements, so that would be the duration of them, and there's no guarantee that they would continue in subsequent years. So it's, as I said, it's a bit of a mixed model approach, and it is capped at the figure that we're requesting, noting that costs are actually going to be probably beyond that, and it is an amount below what is currently, from what we can tell, being expended in the distributed approach that's currently being taken. So look, I'll stop there and happy to take questions.
Just first off, in line with what Councillor Nicol was asking for at the start of the meeting, what rates are funding this?
This
Or
would Yeah.
proposed to fund?
all would be coming from the UAGC.
All coming from the
Yes.
UAGC, right? And since this is an ongoing project, why would this not be an LTP proposal as opposed to starting it out of that cycle?
Right. So because the problem is present right now,
Mhm.
and we wouldn't want to defer it for another 12 months if we could resolve the problem or the issue we're dealing with this year. So yes, it it is potentially deferrable out to an LTP and would have to be considered again potentially at that point. But staff are of the view that this is a real and pressing issue right now. And particularly given the vast tranche of government reform that we've been facing and still are, the requirement to have these consultation processes activated immediately is a genuine problem right now.
So since it's an ongoing thing, does this require any specific consultation process? It doesn't because it's below a certain financial threshold.
Yes.
All right. Councillor Marr.
Yeah, thank you, Neville. I realise you weren't able to present to us on this yesterday, but just a couple of quick questions. There's an indicative figure there of 408,000 OPEX, and I see that that's unquantifiable. You also note that there's a high degree of uncertainty to the amount that we currently spend on iwi consultation. Perhaps Janine could expand on this. I find it, I mean, we have a massive report here that you've done for us on this business case, but we can't actually tell us what we spend now.
Yeah, look, I'll do my best. That was the number that staff were able to identify based on cost coding in the system. The process we currently are following doesn't give us clarity about every dollar that is spent in this space. So how staff arrived at that number was very much about looking at the areas of the business that use this resource and talking to business project managers and business owners and getting to as close as they could. But in terms of tracking all of those, each individual expenditure item in the system, it's not set up that way.
So just coming back to that, so that 408,000, we could assume that that's relatively close to what's been, what we pay per year, or what goes out per year in the iwi consultation.
Yes, that's our best figure
cool.
we could present and put our hand on our heart over. Yes.
Thank you.
If I could just comment on that as well. Clearly, we have some programs of council which are dependent. It's a statutory requirement to do this. And one of the big areas is in the policy programs. And Tracy, I'm just wondering if you might want to comment on what that involves, because clearly extra time equals extra cost right through the system. So Tracy, have you got any comment?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Good morning, councillors. So in anticipation of the question Neville was just asked, I've got the figures here. So for our two policy projects last year for freshwater and for coastal, we have a total of 241,000 for the contracts that had been let. So that is just for two of our 6 policy projects. That doesn't include our other statutory requirements, as Neville said, for consulting with iwi. So that's our 2 big ticket items. I guess from a policy perspective to just help you shape up what that looks like. And they are presently external consultants who we engage to assist us with that, who have experienced all the challenges that Neville outlined at the start of the business case.
Councillor Smith.
So along the same theme, so to be clear, the 408,000 that Councillor Marr has identified, or you in your report, this is an additional 200,000 correct? Yes.
It is, however, noting that there'd be an expectation that that cost that we're currently expending would reduce. What I can't put a finger on and guarantee for you right now is by how much.
So I don't want to get into operational matters, but if this is approved, there would obviously be a cost centre, and going forward, any money that was spent in this area would be to that cost centre, and therefore this council would get a better idea of what is actually being spent.
Exactly. And just to clarify that from an administrative perspective, we realise that it costs extra staff time to administrate and manage these agreements and arrangements and provide that level of insight and transparency. We intend to do that by moving a staff member internally through release capacity in the governance section to be able to administrate this program of work. So we're not seeing any extra cost and staff time to do this, to manage and administrate the process, but we realise it does require a level of technical skill and ability and an ongoing focus to sustain it over the long run.
Thank you.
That was the. All right. Councillor Mahuta.
I'm on. Okay, couple. Thanks, Neville. Probably if it helps councillors with the context, if I just take us back to PC1, that's probably the first big process we engaged with as council with iwi. So the costs were huge to council, and Tracy can speak to those, but they were also huge on the iwi side of the table. So I could say it was dollar for dollar across the 5 river iwi was spent. So it's not just our money being spent in the processes. I just wanted to note that. The other one was, what have we learnt in all this time we've been doing? Are we any better at engaging? Because some of it is what we consider efficient isn't necessarily efficient on the iwi side of the table. I note they provide heaps of forums for us to have our conversations, and then we run a different consultation round on top of that. So just wondering, what have we learnt, and are we the most efficient partner we could be when working with the iwi? And what are our measures of that? Just talking ahead, because along the financial efficiency, we want to process efficiency if the neo reforms are going to work.
Yes.
In terms of the planning reforms. So that's the other one. And probably my last one is if, while it's highlighted as money out, co-investment, iwi-sponsored activity within the region isn't accounted for anywhere. So it seems like it's all council money out. The fact that the WRA and other sources of funding come from with iwi support is not counted against us. So I think you got to see the wholeness of it is what I'm encouraging council to do.
Just in response to that first question around what have we learned, I believe we have learned an incredible amount over recent years, and PC1 was a great, in my experience at least, time I've been here, was a great starting point and awareness raising and an understanding of the requirements upon council for engagement, but also the complexity of undertaking that engagement process. I think we understand now the variability of capacity across the entire region for iwi to be able to engage. Some iwi are more set up for that and are able to respond to our requirements a little bit more efficiently. Others are way away from that standard. So,
again, Neville, I'm talking about partnerships, so we can't require anything of a partner.
No.
We've got to work with them.
Yes.
I'm asking, what have we learned about our partnership behaviour that elicits more of a confident response from iwi? Again, we were slow setting up a partnership committee and governance last term. That gave an indication to iwi that they weren't on our agenda. We've got some work to do this term, although they're showing up for their legislative responsibilities with us. So I just want to change the narrative, because iwi are not a problem, they're a partner. No. Iwi have capacity, it's all being culled to Wellington as well.
Yes.
So again, just want to take the problem mode of iwi partnership, because I think it's a narrative outside of this room. And then for the council team, there are a series held regularly by iwi. Nobody attended. the same way we really learn in terms of our requirement to partner and the way we do partnership in terms of the behaviour. So again, look forward to our iwi partnership committee so we can talk about these things again for efficiency.
I guess just in terms of that, many iwi want to have their own rangatiratanga and to be engaged directly in their own right. That iwi understand their connection to their place and they see that as paramount, that they want to be have that dialogue and relationship to their space. Try this one. Okay, see if this one works. Okay. So I think what we learned, and I think that became evident of the Partnerships Committee as well, that iwi wanted to talk on matters relevant to their areas of interest directly and in their own right and on their own mana whakahaere, their ability to make their have autonomy over their area. So it wasn't more what we would choose to do. So let's take a broad brush approach and talk to all iwi collectively and hope that they're going to get a collective response. So I think that's an insight that's really, really important. I also think that exactly as you've pointed out, that iwi are not the problem, but iwi are also being engaged with on multiple fronts by others. We're not the only party. The Crown have a massive voice at the table and also demanding iwi time and energy in competition with ourselves. And you know, we're hoping that what we're proposing here will be a good start in terms of the solution. But I guess I need to be clear, is probably not the only way of doing this. We still will need to have engagement at a case-by-case basis. But what we will have is greater visibility of the cost and the investment being made as a result of adopting the approach that's being proposed. I know you had another question there, but I've sort of lost it somewhere along the line.
So just so I'm clear, it's sounding like there's a number of ways we can have these conversations and a number of ways that iwi and different iwi might want to have that conversation with us. And I'm also hearing that we don't have necessarily a real clear accounting of how much we spend in this because there's no cost center that all of these get attributed to. And I'm also hearing that the options that are presented, it may be one of them or a combination of them. So I'm not hearing that we necessarily have a clear view of how we might progress with this.
No, I'm clear of the options presented. I'm just making sure we've done the learning because we've got 10 years experience at this.
Yeah.
But it's no use doing the same thing badly for 10 years. But I do want to note, PC1, high trust, everybody in the room, we met a large portion of their own costs because it was efficient for them. We haven't had that kind of relationship since then. So again, we can do the work and make it all easier, or we can make staff work really hard for this trust.
I guess what I'm just thinking about what's before us today. And I guess I'm trying to get straight in my head. If the next year, because my question about why isn't this an LTP process as opposed to this annual plan process, especially because it is an ongoing commitment, is there not value in using, or is there an ability for us to set this up for as a data gathering or a lessons learning process for the next year so that we have very clear a cost center that has accumulated exactly what we're spending in this and have had more conversations about what is the best way in a long-term process for us to provide for this engagement. Just a question.
Getting to your question, Pamela, I would have thought we banked 10 years experience. I was just testing that we had, that this approach has those things under it because they're not spoken to. But if we go back to a paper exercise, that's away from partnership. We've got JMAs, we've got really key decisions that we have to inform in terms of planning cycle. So I'd discourage that. If you want to know which option I prefer, I can tell you that. But I would say that if we go to a nursery again, that's what we did for 3 years, and we lost a whole set of relationships, in my opinion. So,
Thank you, Tippa. Next, I've got Councillor Nicol. Sorry, just so I've got the speaking order, we've got Councillor Nicol, Councillor Strange, Councillor Dunbar-Smith, Councillor Hughes, and then Councillor Smith. So I'm going to get you to turn your lights off so that we can get our speaking order right.
Thank you.
Jennifer.
I am aware that business cases don't get through the LT too lightly. And I see you had 13 and you've narrowed that down by over half. And I'm not surprised that this is one that made it through based on what I've heard and seen with the barriers of the work ahead, the busyness coming up, whether it be freshwater, RMA reform, all those things. We have the big stuff coming up. And the engagement currently, yeah, it's obviously to not approve this would be, let's carry on with the status quo of how we're doing it. But I see that with those policies coming down and all that engagement that we need to do together, it strikes me that we need to keep stepping things up. And I have been part of at least one JMA over the past 3 years, and again currently, and I have had conversations where I've heard how Waikato Tainui, which I'm on, would really like to be able to get to a place where they are a partner to the point where they're not at the back end of the LTP process. And so when I saw in here in the business case that the long-term ambition is very much to have them have conversations with us towards the front end of that process a lot more than currently, I see alignment there around an aspiration I've heard myself with my own ears and a potential way to get there. I'm mindful of the fact that Waikato being a region with some of the largest number of iwi, that there are so many different ways that with very many different partners to engage, that I really want to commend you for the way that it's been structured, and that here's an innovative way of doing things, and here are at least 3 different ways that we could do stuff. I'm assuming that there's going to be quite a bit of flexibility as to which one of those 3 options that you've chosen to give it to us in a combined way is just a way to try different things with different iwi, basically, and then see what works and come back to us in future with other ways of stepping things up again, and to what Tippa was talking about. It's also a way, it's got entire strategy alignment in the sense that our vision is to empower our people and care for our place. This is one way to empower our relationship with iwi in this region. And I'm very mindful of, as chair of the Climate Action Committee and of the climate action work coming up, which also permeates almost every policy, that I'm keen for that engagement with iwi. And we need capacity for that. So the things we're trying to achieve require this. And hence, that's why I say I'm not surprised it's come up and that it's made it through that gating process. I understand that with the budget here, you're showing us there's a bit of there was going to be an increase over time in that budget in the long-term plan anyway, which is that shifting around and bringing forward kind of a bit of work. I'm really, really pleased to see in the report around the fact that MFE in particular, Ministry for the Environment, are very open to partnering, which is what we need through the RMA reform and the freshwater reforms and so forth. And we are actively looking at ways to, I guess, when say the money was approved, that we could capture some of that through central government funding again, because we're talking about getting to a place with Crown, iwi, local government partnership, right? So I'm hearing Crown, central government, Ministry for the Environment giving good signals. Iwi, I've heard myself also, and local government needs to come to the party whenever it's well designed. I'm putting faith in that by trying something innovative and that this has been designed and gotten through that process, that I'd be comfortable to support this one at this point in time. They say, yeah, because you always couch things with that when you're going through an annual plan day. But yeah, thank you.
If I may comment, you raised a very good point there about central government funding and advocacy for that money in a coordinated fashion. They're very real opportunities for us, and I think this model that we're proposing gives us a facility to focus and to get that government support where we may not necessarily have received it unless we put strong advocacy in place. And just to make some reference to some of our advocacy for treaty settlement funding, when I think of the Te Kotahitanga, the Tūwhareto treaty settlement arrangement and the money that was provided for implementing the plan required through that settlement process, we got 400,000 contribution towards that planning process. That was only through direct advocacy from this council and the work we put into lobbying for that level of support. We also received, and I think the number is 375,000 for the Maniapoto settlement arrangement, which we're currently developing at the moment. Again, an example of how coordinated and focused advocacy by this council can actually achieve and leverage financial support out of the Crown for activities that the Crown directs us to undertake. So I do believe that that does set a model in place that we can have some confidence in.
So Strange.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Neville, for your report and your business case as well. Yeah, just to agree with what Jen said around, yeah, thank you for doing something different and quite innovative and looking at a different way to engage. Just to build on Tiba's points as well, that, relationship with iwi is really important to our core business and what we do. And yeah, I really would hope that moving forward, we value that a lot more than I've seen recently. In my experience last training, I found iwi contribution to be invaluable. I sat on a number of region-wide committees, and the way that iwi take a long-term view with, the environment as a foundation was just, it was quite refreshing from all the short-termism that's out there as well. Yeah, and just their input on future-proof and Te Huia, to name a couple that I was involved with. Yeah, it was really invaluable. And I suppose I would love to see more iwi involvement, but I understand capability within iwi as well needs building. So, Tracy, you mentioned before the cost was 2 of 6 work streams. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, so thanks, Councillor. The costs that I quoted were only for the freshwater review and the coastal plan review. So they're not for the other MPS. I'll get on to the other policy programs. And I'm just, they are statutory, they are easy to capture in terms of the costs. We have just been through a fairly extensive iwi program consultation on the coastal plan, and I guess I just want to take the opportunity to address Councillor Mahuta's comments in terms of those coastal hui. We went to all of those that were invited to, and iwi just said for some of those coastal hui, we've got too much on our plate. our people want to hear about these things. Can you use this other avenue? So we went to other avenues. But for me, it is some of the conversations that the organisation has with iwi that are not necessarily just to develop policy. And that's where the real challenge is. And if this business case was forwarded, we still need to do that policy work for fresh water, and that will take up a whole person 150% of the time, 9 days a week. So there is, the rest of the organisation has this need for this work. And yeah, as I said, that was 2 of 6 policy programs. The others haven't been factored in yet. We'll talk about the MPS highly productive land later.
Thank you, Tracy. Just had a few more points. Also, I saw the value firsthand of other investments that we've made within the education arena, and developing young rangatahi and bringing them through and giving them a taster, I suppose, of what we do here at council. So I was sort of wondering, taking a long-term view, building on that, you know, it talks on here about Waikato Tainui, you know, building their internal capability moving forward. And, you know, I sort of see this as being, you know, co-beneficial, you know, building capability within both council and iwi through those education programs, plus what I'm seeing here in this business case as well. So, yeah, really positive about this. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Councillor Dunbar-Smith.
2 questions. On page 85, it shows OPEX of 300,000 for the next 6 years doing. So where does the 200,000 we've got here come in? Page 15 of the document. Or page
Yes,
85?
yes. So this is the full cost of the program, but there are other. So we're assuming that there's $100,000 carry forward from an existing fund that was allocated for Mātauranga Māori, and that was some time ago that fund was allocated. We've achieved the majority of what we set out to do when that fund was established. What we're so the assumption is that we will continue to maintain that funding, but the new investment will only be 200,000.
And terms, this is showing
For first year, sorry.
This is for first year only. So
yes,
it might be
it's the annual plan year. Yes.
And so, in terms of the annual plan process, are we choosing this figure for 1 year, or are we committing 100,000?
So my understanding is that this is an ongoing funding requirement, but we're committing because it's only an annual plan, for the annual plan year. I think I've got that interpretation correct, Janine?
Yeah, I mean, everything effectively is up for grabs when we look at the long-term plan anyway. So this is a direction of travel. It gives the capacity for the next year. But the commitment beyond that will be part of the LTP process review anyway.
And the other question was, you've talked about the SLAs versus consultancy hub versus internal, and indicated that you may not be able to deal, it might be prioritised about who you worked with in terms of iwi. You just want to comment here on the internal fund. Waikato Tainui would prefer to see a fund allocated to iwi to decide where to direct such resource rather than being council directed. This would allow better internal capability building with the suggestion of given tribal member FTE working there. So there's obviously some, how much are you going to have to be able to control the fund through the SLA model?
As the SLA gives us, you know, really good control, though it's not a sustainable for all of our iwi partners. So therefore, we do have to be pragmatic and adopt a prioritisation approach. Should we go down the SLA pathway, or should that be the choice the iwi partners that we have to engage with, that they prefer an SLA. We're going to have to be quite pragmatic and manage that relationship quite closely in respect to how we distribute it and what the expectations are within that agreement. But the agreement does, will be quite specific in respect to the activities and the agreements and arrangements that are undertaken. In regard to your comments about Waikato Tainui, again, the report outlines their reservations about taking people who don't understand their tribal context. And so therefore they would rather have an arrangement where they could choose or use their own people to undertake those activities rather than somebody who was outsourced and would have to be brought up to speed and may not fit in their context and enable them to get the outcome they're seeking. So that was specifically a Waikato Tainui comment, but I think it'd probably be relevant across other iwi partners as well. So the SLAs allows us to provide a level of funding with an agreed commitment and outcome being achieved as a result of that agreement, and that they could use whomever they wanted to support them to undertake that activity. As I said before, there's other options. So there's 2 other options in there in terms of the contractor hub or the internal project management support. We wouldn't do an SLA and then the other 2 with the same party. It would be again, a pragmatic balance between what we've got available and what the need and the requirement is of that iwi partner, and our need of them as well in terms of the engagement and the outcome that we need to collaboratively work towards. So it is a pick and mix, and in terms of the 3 options on the table, it is. But we're not. I guess ultimately we're constrained by the amount of money that we've got available to distribute, and the mechanism through which we can distribute it. It will never ever be enough, and you'll see the figures in there are talked about in terms of it could be over $2 million if we were to enter into arrangements of every iwi partner that we have beyond the key ones that through treaty settlement arrangements. There's a multitude of others that don't have a direct treaty settlement arrangement with us. So we're not proposing that approach. We're proposing a limited and controlled approach that has the best effect for the investment. I know I'm hopefully I'm not confusing people too much by that, but ultimately I say we want control around the size of the fund, the administration of it, and provide 3 options under which it can be accessed, but noting not everybody will be able to access the limited funds or the limited delivery mechanisms that we're providing. That's got to be understood from the get-go.
Do you see that causing tensions between various iwi groups about who gets access to a fund? And
it will come down to the quality of the conversations ultimately and the strength of the relationships. But I don't believe so. The recommendation of staff is no, that we should be able to navigate our way through this arrangement, and noting that, for example, it's only for the 12-month period. It comes back under the we'll come back and have a look at it again at the LTP. We will have learnt some stuff as well through this process, which will no doubt be reported back in when we do the review of the level of service and talk about, well, what did we learn? What did we need? What was the return on the investment? So again, taking a bit of a pragmatic approach to this. The LTP is a gateway through which we have a sense check on what we've proposed to do.
Finally, in our submissions on national built environment, we're concerned about unfunded mandates that central government is handing out. What chance do you think there is of getting money from MFE or these other groups that are mentioned here? Because
I think they're quite high. And we do know, for example, that the Ministry for the Environment established a freshwater fund to support iwi, and I don't know the exact quantum, but it was a significant amount of money was put into that investment. It did require councils to be proactive and lobby and put their case forward. This provides us with a mechanism to do that. So The Crown is as enthusiastic as everybody to get their legislation rolled out and implemented. And so they will put money aside, but it will be a case of getting to the front of the queue and providing very clear and strong advocacy to support what we require to deliver what's asked of us. So yes, I do believe that this process provides us a mechanism to have far more clarity and focus around Crown funding. And I do believe the Crown will continue to provide funding to ensure that its own policy program is implemented and delivered, particularly over this this current year as we lead up to the elections.
Councillor Hughes.
Madam Chair. First point, she's leaving the room. My first point is that I'm surprised that haven't been capturing this data. As I understand it, there's detailed timesheets kept by staff members, so I see no reason why the information couldn't be captured at source. I'm sure any consultants being paid easily enough to code their time. So can I ask that from now on that these costs be captured so we know exactly what dollars we're talking about? Is that practical or not?
Yes, ultimately it is. I guess it's the conversation around at the moment, those costs will be distributed depending on where the work has occurred or that engagement has been needed in the organisation. So within projects, programs, that type of thing, as opposed to the budget being held separate centrally. So it's really a centralised, decentralised. Absolutely, it's something that we can revisit how we're capturing that information so that we've got some really crisp numbers that we can come back to council on.
And my second point, I guess, is to either Neville or to our CE. I was reminded this morning that there are a large number of organisations that engage with council on a number of subjects, and particularly when it comes to legislative matters. You can expect, if we approve this, that they will also be putting their hand up for money. So I'd just like to have that recorded. Thank you.
All right. Councillor Smith, and then I've got Councillor Graf online.
Thank you. In some ways, listening to the conversation since I put my hand on the button, it's been some time. And I'm just reminded and reminding myself that $200,000 is not really material in the sense of the budget that we're talking about on annual expenditure. I suppose for me, council can rate to do what work it relates to, so long as it's our core business. Iwi don't necessarily have the same, and some rely on treaty settlements to give them the capacity to engage. I'm not against this. What I'm disappointed about is council doesn't really know how much it costs us, and it's a best guess scenario. If this is approved, I would absolutely, as I alluded to earlier, and Chris has just touched on it a moment ago, is the costs. And Neville, if I can turn to you, you talked about the $200,000, but then about 5 to 10 minutes ago, you mentioned 100,000 from another fund. In my experience of having been in another council, staff certainly are aware of what funds are where, and in some cases jealously guard those funds, and occasionally councillors find out about them. So what I'm concerned about is, where are we spending the money? And if that $100,000 fund, should it be cascaded into a new cost centre and the likes? And I say, I don't want to get into operational matters, but we need to be able to know what is costing us in our business. So $200,000, it's not a one-off, because if we approve this, it is an ongoing expectation and it will be in perpetuity. And whilst council has every opportunity every 3 years to give and take, once we engage in something like this, I think it would be reprehensible to remove it. So we need to be clear that we want to do it. I'm also mindful of the amount of time it's taken to decide whether we are going to put 200,000 in or not, and look at whether we're going to be here till midnight. So I appreciate that. In my experience, is if it's millions and millions of dollars, it gets decided in a minute, and if it's $10, it takes 2 hours or more. So I think I'd ask you to think, are we in this or not, and let's move on. Thank you.
Councillor Graff.
Oh, yes, look, and there's many cultures and organisations that would love to have direct engagement with the regional council, but they don't get it. And these cultures and organisations, they'd probably object to have to contribute extra money to it when they don't have access to it themselves. So I'm thinking the UAGC mechanism isn't good. I think this, to some people, is going to come across as a divisive issue. And I think it should be central government that funds it. That's what I wanted to say. Thanks.
Just note, no one else has a treaty right.
All right. Are there any other questions with regard to this?
It's the rating model, I think, that's going to be an issue. UAGC. Thanks.
Thanks, Clyde. Janine, did you want to make a comment on that?
Just to note that that funding policy is considered again through the long-term plan in terms of all of our iwi Māori costs. They are where they sit within this governance activity, are funded through the UAGC. In the absence of an external funding source, I guess our UAGC is around those people-related activities rather than property. So this sort of, I guess that's the rationale for that funding mechanism. If council's not happy with that, absolutely the opportunity to take another look at it through the next LTP.
All right. So councillors, just for those of us who've been through these annual plan, long-term planning processes before, we all know that it's a cumulative thing. It's we hear all of the information, we hear from each other, we gather that all together, and at the end is where we sort of divvy things up, because there's always the surplus from last year that is just sitting there that we might be able to apply in certain circumstances if something is really important, but we want to consider it outside of our traditional ways necessarily of providing for those. And so I'm just flagging for everybody that what my intention is we will go through each of these business cases, the 4 of them, and then we'll collectively look at what is the overall package we're looking at. Okay, so just so you have a heads up on that. I don't want to crack into the next one because as you said, Noel, we might. Yeah, well, I was thinking about how long are we going to debate the next one at 324,000.
Madam Chair, just aware that a number of members have to leave throughout
Yes.
the day, and we're actually going to get a very small number that will make this decision. So I'm very nervous about that. If we,
I agree. So we'll eat quick. We'll eat very quickly, and then we'll get back and go on to our next one, which is the regional transport connections. All right, so we will adjourn the meeting with that ambitious challenge. We shall eat and be back here in 20 minutes. All right, thank you.